Kill me. My name is Harvey Bodega, and welcome to the review of Impossible Creatures, a real-time strategy game developed by Relic Entertainment. Although originally released in January of 2003, I'll be playing the 2015 re-release optimized for modern systems. RTS veterans will tell you that Relic is well known for some of the best real-time strategy games of all time, like the Homeworld series, the Company of Heroes series, and the Warhammer 40k Dawn of War series. So why don't we hear about Impossible Creatures nearly as much as those other titles? This game is Relic's only real-time strategy game that lacks a sequel or a series. Why is that? We'll get into that later. Before we figure out what the fuck is happening here, let's touch on the gameplay. The mechanics are fairly standard RTS affair. Develop a base, balance an economy, and build a military to defeat your enemies. It's just that here, your military is comprised of horrifying abominations. Just like any politician or world leader though, before making your own army of demons, you have to first develop the economy. You have two resources to manage, coal and electricity. Coal is obtained by using your henchmen to mine coal deposits and run it back to your lab. Your lab is more or less your town center, and it's worth mentioning that it's a landed flying train. Yes, it's a steampunk setting, thankfully without the weird top hats and goggles. Electricity is passively produced from building lightning rods or an electric generator, which produces more but has to be built on a geyser. For Dawn of War players, this will look familiar, as that game used a revamped version of the Impossible Creatures engine, but I do not believe the electricity generators decay in this game. Coal and electricity fund advancing to the next level, buildings, research, and your hell horde to march on to victory. Depending on your game settings, there is one of 3 victory conditions in skirmish and multiplayer. Defeat your opponents by destroying their base, all of their buildings, or by killing your opponent's Rex Chance in a regicide-like mode. Outside of campaign mode, you can select a campaign character with a pre-made set of 9 creatures, or you can custom design your own army of atrocities. Let's get into creature creation. You can custom curate your monstrosities, diversifying with melee, ranged, aquatic, and flying units, and although you only splice 2 animals together, you have a shocking number of options. It is open for a lot of creativity. For example, I want a creature with the fastest land running speed and water swimming speed as possible, that is relatively cheap. Grab the garfish and splice the legs of a cheetah on there. What about a cheap scout? Take the barn owl for the relative cheapness of a flying unit, and slap a giraffe's head on there for line of sight. Splice hornet's wings on a sperm whale, create a dragonfly kangaroo, fuse a wolf with the legs of an ant, break every law of science and ethics, spit in God's eye and dare him to stop you. Sorry, I got carried away there. Many creatures have special abilities that present in combat, like why not have a porcupine rhinoceros? The rhino can charge into battle, and the porcupine has a damaging area of effect ability. What about a lobster great white shark? Allow it to walk on land and regenerate health with lobster DNA, but swim quickly with a wicked bite from the great white. The way this is supposed to be balanced is that the creatures are unlocked upon researching their level, starting at 1 and going to 5. So when creating a unit, if combining certain creatures exceeds a threshold of what is allowed in a tier, then it bumps it to the next one. For instance, a tier 1 wolf and a tier 1 zebra make a tier 2 creature. Additionally, more stats and abilities equal a higher cost. Creatures with a lot of special abilities will cost more electricity, while higher base stats will require more coal. The room for trial and error is very vast, but unfortunately, not every idea is a good one. A well-constructed, more optimized army will absolutely dunk on a poorly balanced one. Honestly, I spent a lot of time trying to determine if I was bad at the game, or that the teams that I built just sucked. Probably both. Difficulty options do play a role in this, of course. In my understanding, the higher difficulty computer enemies start with more resources, focus on a much more optimized resource collection, and can likely see what kind of units you're making. So the AI sort of cheats, but thankfully it's not as badly as some other RTSs of the era. You don't have to worry about that in multiplayer, however, just that you might be facing a StarCraft veteran. That's really the main driver of Impossible Creatures. Make your own army of mad science experiments, and send them to eat your neighbors. The graphics and creature unit design are quite solid for the era. Yeah, it's dated, but the sort of cartoonish style really fits the game's ludicrous tone. After seeing some creature combinations, I wouldn't want to see them in AAA visual fidelity. This game is about building an army of genetically hybridized mad science experiments, and each combination of creature traits is modeled. In addition to adjustable appearances, each creature has a different audio callout depending on which animal parts make it up. The sounds are really nothing special, but that extra layer of customization is very satisfying. On the other hand, the voice acting is the exact goofiness you'd want from an RTS with such a ridiculous premise.
Together we can put a stop to all those evildoers.
A man walks into a bar with a pig under one arm and a 3-foot salami under the other. The bartender... excuse me.
There's a penalty for being a traitor where I come from. Death.
I was really tickled by the henchmen. Your basic units are these stocky oafs, and their voices match perfectly.
Boss? Hello? Ready, boss? Hello?
It's fair to note that the human character models have aged poorly, but that's unsurprising and understandable for an RTS. Close-ups on unit models really only take place in the campaign, however, so it doesn't have a big impact on the game. Anyway, besides the good voice acting, the other sounds are just okay, but the music in the menu is really worth mentioning. It's only one song, but I only started getting sick of it after hearing it for the 1000th time, because it's so great. Overall, presentation is pretty solid and establishes the game's lighthearted and zany tone. So how the hell does the campaign justify this premise? Well, starting off with the setting, Impossible Creatures is in 1937, a pre-war era where scientific advancement was less concerned with ethics and more concerned with other things. Rex Chance, the main character, is one of those roguish adventuring types. Think Indiana Jones or Brendan Fraser from The Mummy, complete with treating native people as a true American tourist.
You speak English. Great. Me, friend. Me need help.
You don't say.
His father, Eric Chanikov, who has been absent for most of his life, summons him to a remote archipelago to learn more about his life's work. Rex, an ex-war correspondent and journalist, takes the opportunity to learn about his mysterious father. It turns out he had discovered how to splice creatures together, and powerful people have been exploiting his technology to accomplish their own ends. That's really the long and short of the story. Stop the bad guy and his friends, learn a thing or two about your main character and his father along the way. Honestly, the story here is sort of a lighthearted romp, as the campaign is a series of skirmish battles with a few additional objectives, including collecting animal DNA in order to add them to your hybrid army. Oh, and Rex's dad had spliced animal DNA into him, giving him special abilities. After learning things like that, maybe my parents didn't do so bad. Anyway, this all sounds great, but there are some problems responsible for why this game hasn't been cemented as an RTS classic, but more of a niche cult classic. First, completely not unique to Impossible Creatures, pathfinding is rough. Since creatures can be so many different sizes, guiding them through choke points on the map or to attack a specific enemy oftentimes breaks them up into a single file line. There are no effective formations like in other RTSs, so most of the fighting ends up being a big, messy brawl. Creature movements are not typically very crisp or responsive, so it's a little frustrating to intensively micromanage. So that hurts Impossible Creatures' skill ceiling and Major League Gaming esport potential, but I think another aspect puts the biggest nail in competitive potential and is likely responsible for this game not reaching a classic status. I would say that's strategic depth. For example, a lot of real-time strategy games or any strategy or tactical games offer a level of depth to combat, typically as a rock-paper-scissors counter system. For example, warriors beat rogues that beat mages that beat warriors, or swords that beat spears that beat axes that beat swords. Empire Earth is a great example of this for an RTS. Although this trope has been overdone in many ways, it offers strategic depth in developing counter strategies or offering 500 IQ strats to fight your way back from a disadvantage. As for Impossible Creatures, I'll quote the Entertainment Weekly review from 2003. Quote, "If most real-time strategy titles are elaborate versions of rock, paper, scissors, Impossible Creatures is the world's most sophisticated game of rock." End quote. I do think this is too harsh, but I see the perspective. Let's talk this through. I mentioned that there are ranged, melee, amphibious or water-based, and flying creatures, but none of these get a stat bonus or damage multiplier against each other. That's okay. Having something similar to a rock, paper, scissors system is not at all necessary, and if the mechanics and balance of units is done excellently, a much more nuanced system with great strategic depth emerges. With Impossible Creatures, there isn't really much counterplay. For instance, creatures with dash abilities and high speeds can get in on ranged units, but they're not necessarily weaker than melee units, and oftentimes have a more powerful melee attack than they do ranged. How about that on most maps? You can ignore water creatures altogether, rendering amphibious and swimming units almost useless. The computer does this very commonly. Although, to be fair, you'll always need one unit that can cover both land and water.
Hello?
On the other hand, if you construct a balanced, fleshed-out team with only melee, flying, and emphasis on ranged, you're likely to experience no downsides. Even if you nail that aspect, what it eventually will come down to is if you can produce better optimized creatures faster than your opponent. I think that's what's meant by the world's most sophisticated game of rock. But damn it, this rock is sophisticated, and it can get even more complicated with mods. The two most well-established ones, the Terulian mod and the Creature Chaos mod, add more balance, more creatures, and more, well, chaos. If you like the base game, there's so much more for you here. So Impossible Creatures is not conducive to being an esports sensation like StarCraft. Pathfinding is rough, and it doesn't have the strategic depth that its younger sibling, Dawn of War, would employ. You know what? That's okay. This game is still super fun. Impossible Creatures somehow took me back to the feeling of my siblings and I linking our Game Boy Colors to duel on the silver or gold versions of Pokemon. Yeah, no one is surprised when a Blastoise is in the lineup, but a Chinchou or a Noctowl will raise some eyebrows. The hybrid combinations in Impossible Creatures are like all Chinchous and Noctowls, with only a few Blastoises. This game also emulated the lesson we could all learn from The Genius of Love, the 1981 hit single by the Tom Tom Club. Sometimes, if something is weird and ridiculous enough, it can be good, but it can't be a cult classic without something really special holding it up. In Genius of Love, it's the guitar riff. In Impossible Creatures, the premise, maybe the gimmick, of custom crafting your own real-time strategy army of Hell Pit abominations makes this game really worth picking up. Thank you so much for watching. I hope to have more content for you soon. Thank you.
Hello.